Every government has an official story about its wars. These 12 films expose the lie behind it. The punishment? Banned, buried, erased, by everyone from France to the Pentagon. Welcome back to VintageVerse. Here are the films they didn't want you to see. How does a cartoon get banned as enemy propaganda? In 2008, an Israeli director made a film about a war he couldn't remember, and the result was the animated documentary Waltz with Bashir. Director Ari Folman was a soldier during the 1982 Lebanon War, but a key piece of it was just gone. A black hole in his memory where the Sabra and Shatila massacre should have been. So he did something radical. He created a documentary using animation, not to invent a fantasy, but to reconstruct a traumatic reality, piece by painful piece. In Israel, the film was a bombshell, a public therapy session that forced a national reckoning. But across the border in Lebanon, where the massacre happened, the government saw an Israeli soldier's story as an insult, a piece of enemy propaganda. They banned it completely. The film went on to get an Oscar nomination, becoming a landmark for its courage. It proved that sometimes the biggest fight isn't on the battlefield, but against the memories a nation tries to bury. The film is about one man trying to remember. A government banned it to make sure everyone else forgot. The biggest protests against the Vietnam War didn't happen on college campuses. They happened inside US military bases, a fact the government buried for 30 years. The 2005 documentary Sir, No Sir uncovers an organized anti-war movement that spread across US bases worldwide, led by active duty GIs. Using long-hidden archival footage and interviews with the soldiers who were there, it reveals the underground newspapers printed on military property, the GI coffee houses that became hubs of dissent, the petitions, and the acts of resistance. At its peak, tens of thousands of soldiers refused orders, signed petitions, or went to jail rather than keep fighting. This wasn't a few disgruntled soldiers. It was a full-blown internal rebellion. For the Pentagon, that truth was a direct threat to the image of an obedient, patriotic fighting force. By hiding the revolt inside the ranks, the government controlled the story of who opposed the war and why. The film's achievement was finding the evidence they tried to bury and putting it back in the history books. The film exposed what the government buried and forced history to tell the truth. The Soviet government wanted a film about World War II heroes. The director, Elim Klimov, gave them a film about a child descending into hell, and he called it Come and See. For 8 years, Klimov fought the state censors to get it made. The problem wasn't the subject matter. The USSR was fine with movies about Nazi atrocities. The problem was the approach. Klimov's script was a journey into pure subjective trauma. It had no uplifting propaganda, no clear heroes, just the relentless, surreal horror of war through a boy's eyes. The authorities at Goskino, the state film agency, were terrified. They demanded cuts and rewrites, trying to sand down the film's terrifying edges. They knew this wasn't the sanitized, glorious war story the public was used to. But Klimov refused to compromise. He waited, held his ground, and finally, during a brief political thaw, got the green light to create his masterpiece exactly as he had envisioned it. Years later, he said, "I lost interest in making films. Everything that was possible I felt I had already done." Maybe that was the cost of truth, to show war exactly as it is and never return to it again. What he left behind was one of the most powerful and disturbing war movies ever made. Peter Davis's 1974 documentary Hearts and Minds did something the US establishment found unforgivable. It took their own words and used them as a weapon.
History of conflict among nations does not record another such lengthy and consistent chronicle of error as we have shown in Vietnam.
By the time it came out, America was sick of Vietnam. But this film showed what the country didn't want to face. Davis's method was devastatingly simple. He took the official footage, Lyndon Johnson, General Westmoreland, all of them promising victory and a moral crusade, and slammed it right up against the truth. Kids screaming from napalm, coffins on a conveyor belt, a shattered country. The whiplash was brutal. It made an undeniable case that the war was a disaster built on lies. The powers that be knew how dangerous that was. This was a modern suppression campaign, not some old-school government ban. The distributor got cold feet under pressure. Powerful figures sued to block its release, trying to silence it. It didn't work. The film got out, it won the Oscar. One of the most powerful war documentaries ever made. It just lets the architects of the war hang themselves with their own words. For decades, the official story in France was simple. Everyone resisted the Nazis. Then The Sorrow and the Pity, a 4-hour documentary from 1969, exposed that state-sponsored myth. Post-war France, under de Gaulle, built its modern identity on that single story, a heroic resistance that erased the shame of collaboration. Marcel Ophuls' film was dangerous because he didn't argue. He went to one quiet city and simply let people speak. Collaborators, German officers, and ordinary citizens who looked the other way. What emerged was damning testimony, a portrait of a country complicit in its own occupation. That mattered because the myth shaped schoolbooks, politics, and who was allowed to speak about the past. By breaking the silence, Ophuls forced public debate in newspapers, classrooms, and living rooms, and opened space for victims, historians, and a national reckoning. French state television, which funded the film, refused to air it. They buried it for over a decade. This was the film that forced a country to trade a comforting myth for an uncomfortable history. The French government called 1966's the Battle of Algiers propaganda and banned it. The Pentagon called it required viewing and held screenings. Director Gillo Pontecorvo shot it with such stark, newsreel immediacy that audiences thought they were watching documentary footage. He didn't pick a side. He showed the street-level mechanics of the Algerian War. The FLN planting bombs in cafes, French paratroopers sweeping neighborhoods, rounding up suspects, and using systematic torture to dismantle resistance. This wasn't a heroic war movie. It was a clinical manual on how to run an insurgency and how to crush one. For a France desperate to forget the brutality of empire, seeing its own soldiers on screen was an impossible truth. They kept it dark for 5 years. The silence only magnified the picture, turning the ban into a global phenomenon. Militaries studied it, filmmakers copied it, politicians feared it. It changed tactics, cinema, and politics. What one government buried as propaganda, another used as a textbook. A brutal, brilliant masterpiece. Necessary cinema that refuses to let you look away. The War Game. The BBC asked for a film showing what a nuclear strike on Britain might look like. What they got was so real, so horrifying, they banned it themselves. Peter Watkins didn't make fiction. He made Fallout. Shot like a news report, The War Game unfolds with clinical calm. Blinding flashes, radiation burns, firestorms swallowing neighborhoods, and a government completely overwhelmed. There's no score, no heroism. Only the machinery of catastrophe rendered as nightly news. That was the problem. The British government feared mass panic, but more than that, they feared outrage. The film exposed the impossible lie that nuclear war could ever be manageable. With anti-nuclear protests growing, they locked it away. It never aired on TV, but it won the Oscar and became legend. The film too real to show its own people. The government decided the best way to handle a nuclear threat was to prevent the public from thinking about it. Stanley Kubrick didn't just make a movie with paths of glory. He picked a fight with the entire country of France. The film's plot, based on a novel about a real hushed-up World War I incident, was The Insult. It shows French generals in their chateaus ordering a suicide mission. When the men fail, the top brass, to cover their own incompetence, demands executions. They handpick 3 innocent men to be shot for cowardice. This portrayal of its military as vain, murderous, and willing to kill its own troops to save face was a direct assault on France's national pride. But it was the timing that made it toxic. In 1957, France was bogged down in the brutal, controversial Algerian War. They couldn't have a major American film showing their army as villains while another war was raging. The government didn't just ban it at home. They pressured diplomats to get screenings canceled in Belgium and Switzerland. Veterans groups protested. The ban in France lasted 18 years. Kubrick held up a mirror, and France spent nearly 2 decades trying to smash it. The U.S. Army hired legendary director John Huston to make Let There Be Light, a documentary about returning war heroes. They hated the result so much they buried it for 35 years. The Army expected a victory lap, a nice piece of propaganda showing the boys were all right. But John Huston just turned his cameras on and filmed the truth. He captured the unscripted reality of psychological trauma, what we now call PTSD. His lens didn't find heroes, it found patients. Men who were shaking, men who couldn't speak, men who were just shattered. The War Department saw the footage and panicked. This wasn't a recruitment poster, it was a document of the damage. They wanted heroes, not broken men. They called it demoralizing, locked it in a vault, and kept it hidden from the public until it was finally declassified in 1981. This film is the receipt, the proof that the government knew the true cost of war and decided to hide it. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had a special name for 1937's La Grande Illusion, cinematic public enemy number 1. The film was dangerous because of one radical idea. Director Jean Renoir shows French POWs and their German captors, and he just lets them talk. You realize the aristocratic French captain and the German camp commandant have more in common with each other than with their own working-class soldiers. They bond over rules, manners, a shared past. The film argued that class and basic decency were stronger than a line on a map. To an ideology like fascism, which needs blind nationalist hatred to function, this message was an act of sabotage. It told the audience to see the person, not the uniform. When the Nazis invaded France, their orders went beyond a simple ban. Goebbels ordered every print seized and destroyed, trying to erase it from history. For decades, the film was believed to be lost forever. Turns out, the Red Army snagged a print from Berlin in '45. It sat, mislabeled, in a Moscow vault for 20 years before anyone realized what they had. America had all quiet on the Western Front. Germany answered with Westfront 1918, and then banned it for treason. Released at the tail end of the Weimar Republic, Pabst's film dropped into a country still reeling from defeat, hungry for pride, but haunted by the trenches. He took audiences straight back there. Mud, blood, panic, shot with a realism that felt ripped from a combat reel. There were no heroes, no redemption, just German soldiers as terrified, suffering victims. A soldier dies whispering, "We're all to blame." That single moment blew apart the story Germany was trying to tell itself. The film stripped away glory and left nothing but guilt, a vision so honest that when the Nazis rose, it became their first target. The message couldn't coexist with the myth. When Hitler took power in '33, Westfront 1918 was erased. But its ghost lingered. Proof that truth on film can wound a nation deeper than any bullet. A cinematic autopsy of a war a nation refused to let die. Some films get bad reviews. In 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front got stink bombs and Nazi riots. This American film landed in Germany the same year as their own Westfront 1918, and both showed the same inconvenient truth. All Quiet's crime was how it portrayed German soldiers as broken, terrified victims of a pointless meat grinder. The rising Nazi party couldn't have that. They needed those dead soldiers to be remembered as martyrs to sell the next war. Joseph Goebbels saw the film's truth as a direct attack. He used it as a test. He unleashed his brown shirts in a campaign of organized political terror, stink bombs, mice in the aisles, brawls. And it worked. The weak Weimar government caved and banned the film just to stop the violence. It was Goebbels' first big win, proof that he could bully the state into censoring art. When Hitler took power, the ban was made permanent. Goebbels proved the film's point. You can't start a new war until you've buried the truth about the last one. And once that truth is buried, history starts all over again. History keeps repeating, but these films refuse to lie about it. Watch them, share them, keep them alive. Because the truth only disappears when we stop looking for it.